keynote speaker, Professor Lee Fennell from the University of Chicago. I will introduce her in a moment, but before this, we have some opening remarks from Professor Paolo Carta, who is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law, and give me the chance to really thank the Faculty of Law for the strong support that it gave to this conference, and part of the success of this conference is due to their support. So thanks a lot to the Faculty of Law, and now some opening remarks from Professor Carta.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Giuseppe. I'm Paolo Carta, I'm Professor of History of Political Thought and Political Theory here at the University of Trento, who happens to be the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law. It is an honor and a privilege for me to welcome you on behalf of the Dean, Professor Fulvio Cortese, and the Faculty of Law of Trento to this plenary session that closes the 7th annual conference of the Italian Society of Law and Economics. I would also like to express my gratitude to all of you for accepting to be here in a moment when traveling is still not easy, and when we are still experiencing restrictions to hosting in-person events. Your presence here is a way to start restoring normalcy in a certain way. Our students in Trento breathe law and economics right from the very first classes. It is a distinctive feature of our degree programs, and our students learn both the results that this approach has helped achieve and those still critical aspects which imply further efforts to identify new tools to think about the law. But let me add something more personal to introduce this session. I'm very grateful to the Italian Society of Law and Economics and my colleague, Professor Giuseppe Bellantuono, for allowing me to attend this keynote speech. Like all the attendants, I'm a fan of the work of Professor Lee Fennell. Since I'm a follower of the Public Law and Legal Theory Working Papers series organized by the Public Law and by the Law School of the University of Chicago. I can't forget her piece on Nozick's theories, inverted theories. And I should add that Slices and Lamps, her book about the superpower of configuration and reconfiguration, of dividing and putting together things that come in lumps and pieces, is one of the readings suggested to my students of the political theory classes of these last 2 years. So it is with an immense pleasure that I leave the floor to our chair so I can go to enjoy her speech. But before that, I would like to thank you again for being with us and thank all of you for this great opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Carta. Very kind of you. Now let me briefly introduce Professor Fennell. I don't need to spam too many words because many of you are already familiar with her scholarship. Professor Fennell is Max Pam Professor at the Law School in Chicago, and she's also affiliated with many programs in that university, the Co-Sander Institute for Law and Economics, the Kreisman Initiative on Housing Law and Policy, the program on Public Service and Public Interest Law, and the Public Interest Faculty Mentor Program. Her teaching and research interests are really wide-ranging, and they cover property, torts, land use, housing, social welfare law, state and local government law, and public finance. And she wrote 2 books, The Unbounded Home, Property Values Beyond Property Lines in 2009, and in 2019, Slices and Lamps, Division and Aggregation in Law and Life. And she also co-edited other 2 books on evidence and innovation in housing law and policy, and on fairness in law and economics. So let me say very quickly what a great pleasure is to have with us a scholar like Professor Fennell, because she really makes crystal clear what is the meaning of using law and economics as a two-way street, which is exactly the kind of perspective that has been debated in this conference. And of course, it is a perspective that was very clear to all of us in the previous conferences. That is, whether you start with economic concept or whether you start with a legal concept, then you have to find a way to integrate them and to open up new avenues for research. And this is exactly what was wonderfully made by Professor Fennell in her scholarship. For example, about the superpower of configuration of resources. And these are her words. That is, how you deal with complementarities among resources, how you deal with lumpiness, and how you apply and you revisit and provide new meanings to traditional legal concepts, starting from externalities, but then going to transaction costs, and trying also to identify what is peculiar with some collective actions problems linked to the lumpiness of resources, and more generally to the possibility to bundle and unbundle resources. And let me say the last word, I also really a great fan of how Professor Fennell is addressing the double challenge of implementing economic efficiency with legal tools, but at the same time paying attention to distributive issues. And today we are probably going to hear a new stage in her research on these topics. I don't know exactly what she is going to talk about, but from the title of her speech, I can understand these are the topics that she is going to cover. So Professor Fennell, thanks a lot for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bellantuono and Dean Carta, for a generous introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I thank all of you for joining me and for making all the arrangements for me to be beamed in virtually. I wish I could be assembling there with you in person, but I'm very grateful that we were able to solve our assembly problem in this way. I'm going to try to share my screen now. We'll see if that works. Are you all able to see that? Is that okay?
Okay, perfect.
All right, good deal. So my talk is called Assembly Problems, Old and New. And I start from a very simple premise that we often need to put resources together into particular configurations or keep them in particular configurations in order to get the most value out of them. And that can be difficult, that can present problems. And some of those assembly problems that we face are old, by which I mean that we're accustomed to think of them as assembly problems. So if we think about assembling land for a highway or putting together patents to make a new product, I've long been interested in these kinds of assembly problems, how to solve them. But I'm also interested in what I'm calling here new assembly problems. And these are not necessarily new problems, but they are problems that we might not naturally think of as assembly problems. And so the direction that my research is going, that I want to get to in this talk, is thinking about problems that might not initially seem to us as assembly problems, but that actually turn out to be when we look at them closely. Issues like dividing up land, creating a new platform-based market in the sharing economy, introducing new goods that have high fixed costs of production, or creating a public good like curing a disease, or addressing large-scale challenges like climate change or COVID. So I don't claim that all of these problems are exactly alike or that they can all be solved in the same way, but many of the differences and similarities cut across different contexts. And so I'm interested in looking at the structure and seeing where problems resemble each other, whether or not when we initially look at it, we think of it as an assembly problem. Okay, so I want to start with I guess, the old assembly problems, familiar ones. I'll start with the example of land assembly. The picture here is of Suzette Kilo's little pink house, which gained fame as the result of an eminent domain action that was undertaken by the city of New London, Connecticut, and that was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 2005. The city of New London wanted to assemble land so it could undertake an economic redevelopment project, and Suzette Kilo didn't want to sell her house. So eminent domain stepped in. It's kind of a brute force response to a certain type of assembly problem. But whether or not that kind of response is necessary or whether there's other responses that might work better depends on how the problem is structured. So I'm very interested in thinking about the structure of these problems, whether we're talking about land assembly or some other type of problem. Okay, so what we may be dealing with are production functions that are nonlinear. And I have a couple of examples here. On the left is a pure step good. Okay, so this would be an example like a bridge or a highway or a pipeline, something like that, where you get all the value only once you complete it. As you add parcels, you kind of have this flat line. And then once you have all the pieces, you have something that's valuable. Okay, so we often run into things that are somewhat like this. And these correspond to the idea of lumpy goods, that you need the whole thing. Sometimes the lumpiness is a little less extreme, like on the right-hand side, where we have an S-curve, where you have a region of kind of slow increase, and then you start to have accelerating returns as you add more segments or more parcels to your assembly. And then those accelerate for a while, and then we have a region towards the end where it plateaus, right? Where there's a decelerating region of decreasing marginal returns. And so many kinds of things in life are kind of like this. A lot of issues that come up in cities are kind of like this, where we might think about maybe we're trying to develop an arts district in a downtown. And if we first put in one little gallery or something, or a couple of galleries that are far apart, it's not going to do much. But after we start to gain a critical mass, then we can really start things rolling. Okay, so we often have assembly problems that look like something like one of these, or they may take a lot of other shapes. But the point is that whenever we have nonlinear production functions like this, we can gain or lose value just based on whether we're able to stack together our particular inputs or whether they're scattered. And this is why I think that configuration is a superpower. As was mentioned, that's what I talk about in my book, Slices and Lumps, is that we have a lot of value that can be gained just based on how things are put together. Okay, so even though not all assembly problems are structured the same way, they do have two things in common. And these two things are going to be important whether we're talking about sort of these old style problems like land assembly or some of the, what I'm calling new assembly problems that don't initially seem to be assembly problems. So first of all, they're never only about putting together resources. A resource assembly problem is not just about resource assembly. It's not just about assembling a resource. It's really about putting together the cooperation of the people who control the resources. So again, if we think about land assembly, it's not a problem for the land. The land doesn't resist being assembled. The problem is that the individual people who control the land may resist having the land be part of an assembly. Okay, so we have to think about the people who control access to the resource and identify who they are and whose cooperation is necessary. Secondly, assembly problems are also division problems. And here I'm referring to the fact that if we're going to reconfigure something and make it more valuable, then there's going to be some surplus from that. And figuring out how to divide that surplus is going to be crucial to ever getting the reconfiguration to happen in the first place. Okay, so thinking about the division aspect of it becomes important. So when we talk about something like land assembly, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's not really just about the land. It's not really just about assembly. It's also a cooperation problem. and a division problem. And once we think about assembly problems as having those two components, the assembly of cooperation and the division of surplus, we can use those things to gauge their difficulty and figure out what kind of response is necessary. We can also use it to identify additional structurally similar problems that might not seem like assembly problems at first. Okay, so let's start with the first point, the difficulty of an assembly problem. It really turns on who exactly has to agree. I'm referring here to requirements of participation and specificity. And if we're thinking about assembling land, who has to agree? Who controls the relevant parcels of land or the relevant permissions to put together the land? Does there need to be unanimity? Is it a flexible set of pieces to be put together where we don't need all of them, or we can use different ones? Can they substitute for each other? How tightly tethered is it to one spot? Can we look around for places nearby that we might be able to put together a similar assembly? How contiguous do the pieces need to be? Can there be some gaps or sort of uneven shapes? Are there constraints on the edges? And then if we think about, again, about eminent domain, to what extent is there some kind of coercive process that steps in if there is not the ability to get all the agreement and all the buy-in from the people who control the resource? And those things together will kind of tell us how difficult the problem is. Here's a little bit of a visual example. This is just an aerial shot of an area, a neighborhood. Let's say that we want to do a land assembly project here. Well, if it needs to look like that, we need it to be a triangle, it needs to be exactly this, then we need the people who control those parcels to agree. We need exactly all those people to agree. It has to be unanimous. But it might be that we could get by with something a little different, maybe like that, or maybe like that. Or maybe it doesn't even need to be contiguous if we're able to acquire like these 3 purple sites. So knowing what our specifications are is going to tell us what kind of assembly problem we are actually dealing with, and will tell us something about its difficulty. Now, the other thing that matters here is the nature of the rights that the people who control resources, what is the nature of the rights that they hold? Okay, so it's sometimes said that property is monopoly. And is that true? Is owning a piece of property like having a monopoly? Well, it depends on a couple of things. First of all, it depends on whether there is property rule protection in the Calabresi and Melamed dichotomy between property rules and liability rules. Property rules mean that you, as the owner, have a veto over how your property is going to be used. So is that the nature of the rights that people are holding? Then they do have the power to control that particular piece of property. But that may not matter very much unless we're in a situation where there's no good substitutes for their input. Okay, so here we think about like how unique is the item? Is it something that's uniquely necessary for the assembly? And that gets back to the issues of, is unanimity required? Is there flexibility? Okay, so these are questions that come up when we think about familiar forms of assembly, but they also come up when we think about some additional forms of problems that may not initially look like assembly problems. Okay, property rights also, I should say, are only part of the story. I'm a property professor. I love property. I always talk about property rights. They're really important, but there are other rights that come into play, other forms of control over resources that can also matter. So here's another example of an assembly issue in the US. This is the path of the pronghorn, which is a federally designated migratory route that's used every year by the pronghorn, which are these animals that you see running along on the right-hand side of the screen. They're kind of like antelope. They migrate every year between Wyoming's Green River Valley and Grand Teton National Park, and they need a contiguous corridor to move across, or they cannot make the trip. And so how do we create that? Well, there's been the ability to create a contiguous wildlife corridor. And part of the issue, of course, is if you have property owners who own pieces of land along that route, then you have to make certain that they're able to cooperate in allowing the migration to happen. But a lot of the land in this area is publicly owned. A lot of it's controlled by a US agency, the Bureau of Land Management. And that means that, well, okay, at one level it's public land, and so the government can decide to allow the pronghorn, but it also means that we have to worry about all the other constituents who might want to be using that public land for some other use, like grazing or gas well drilling or something else that could interfere with the pronghorn's migration. And that too, dealing with those issues becomes an assembly problem as well. There's also highways that cut across this area, which requires building things like overpasses and in some cases underpasses. And if any of this land is being used for any kind of grazing or anything, then there's this issue about the fences. Even though these animals, these pronghorn, look like they're very agile and springy and like they could leap over anything, they don't actually like to jump over fences for some reason. They like to go under. So this ends up creating an issue about assembling the full corridor and making certain that it's free of impediments. And that's true whether it's privately owned or whether it's publicly owned, and there have to be issues about exactly how it's going to be managed. Okay, so once we see control over a resource as the relevant thing that we're assembling, we can recast a lot of other problems as being assembly problems. So one example of this is when we think about conservation efforts that require people to forbear from harvesting resources. Okay, so here's a little snip from a famous piece about lumpy goods by Michael Taylor and Hugh Ward, where they talk about, let's say we have a fishery and it's in danger of suffering some kind of collapse if we exploit it too much. Well, this is kind of the opposite of the graph that I showed before, where we have a step good that steps up in value all at once. Here we have a problem where if we exploit too much, we drop down in value all at once. You know, maybe all in one big step, or maybe there's a very sharp decline that happens in a discontinuous way. Regardless, there's a cliff effect here. And what's necessary to not go over the cliff is to put together, to assemble the cooperation of enough people to forbear from overexploiting the resource. Okay, so well, how do we do that? Well, it turns out to be an assembly problem, and a difficult one that has some characteristics that are a little different from our land assembly, but that also can be thought of in assembly terms. Okay, so here's an example of an example that didn't go well. This is a tragic example of the phenomenon of having these kinds of cliff effects. And this is the fate of the passenger pigeon. One time, the passenger pigeon was the most common bird in North America, and it had massive flocks. There were massive flocks that would darken the skies. There were populations in the billions. What you're seeing on the left here is sort of a computer-generated reenactment of what it was like when there were all of these passenger pigeons. In fact, they went extinct. The last one died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. So it went from billions to none rather rapidly due to intensive hunting. And this example points out something important about assembly, which is the need to see what's happening and to understand if you have some kind of a cliff structure and the fact that you're close to going over it. That was hard to see in this case because the passenger pigeon was a migratory species. It was only present intermittently in any given place, so it was not alarming if you didn't see it all the time. And whenever they were present, they would form large flocks to evade predators. So anytime you did see them, you saw a lot. It was hard to gauge their decline. It was hard to connect the acts of individual hunters to any increment of depletion. And there was also the fact that if some people decided, wow, we're worried about the pigeons, we're going to stop hunting them, other hunters would come in and take up the slack. So if we can see this as being an assembly problem and one that has an all or nothing character, we can think about what would it take to structure cooperation. Okay, so in thinking about mechanisms to structure cooperation in this kind of context, one example is a sort of recent work that has been done on the preservation of a different bird, the bobolink. This is a songbird that has a call that reportedly, I haven't heard one myself, but it reportedly sounds like the R2-D2 character in Star Wars, is sort of how the call sounds. They like to nest in the grasslands, and unfortunately for them, their nesting season is also occurring at the same time that local farmers are usually haying in the area, and in doing the haying, they disrupt the nests. So the idea was, well, what if we could pay the farmers to delay doing the haying until after nesting season by paying them their opportunity cost? Well, that required putting together a chunk of money. And some recent work experimented with mechanisms for doing that, where donors could contribute. And it would work a little bit like the way that Kickstarter funding works for startup projects, where if different people contributed, they would get their money back unless it reached a threshold that was enough to cause to meet a contractual requirement that the farmer would not do the haying. And so kind of reaching that threshold was the trigger for being able to accomplish an increment of conservation. Okay, so some interesting examples there about how to structure mechanisms. Sometimes there are other ways to assemble cooperation by using modern technology, using platforms or online connections to be able to put together things that might otherwise be difficult. Here's another example that in the theme of assembling forbearance. When we think about a big problem like climate change, it's often very discouraging because it doesn't seem like anything that any individual can do can matter very much. And one of the few things that seem to be accessible to people to do to help with climate change would be to change their diet in some way. But not everyone is prepared to become a vegan or vegetarian. Moving to plant-based diets can do a lot to alleviate climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but not everyone is prepared to do that. However, a lot of people might be willing to be vegan or vegetarian or have a plant-based diet one day a week. Okay, so here's an idea that someone named Matt Johnson came up with, and Ian Ayres mentioned this on a blog of his some years ago. It's the idea that what if you could get together a group and together create the equivalent of an entire vegan or vegetarian by each of 7 friends, or people who they don't have to be friends. They could just be people who coordinate over the internet, who decide to each take a day of the week and be meatless on that day, right? Then together they could cumulatively build an entire vegan. And what would be the advantage of doing it this way? Well, it creates a visible increment of forbearance, in a sense, a visible increment of change that may seem more meaningful than individuals just saying, well, I'll cut back on meat or something like that. So I've already mentioned that resource assembly problems are also division problems. And this example shows how dividing up responsibility in a particular way can make a difference. We can also understand resource division problems as being assembly problems as well, once we recognize that cooperation, which is getting everyone on board, agreeing to the new configuration, is what's being assembled. So the anti-commons literature, Michael Heller wrote a lot about this. Frank Michelman initially came up with the concept. It often suggested that assembling resources might be harder than breaking them apart. But that's not necessarily so. It all depends on who has to agree to the new configuration and whose cooperation has to be assembled. Okay, so let's look at some examples like this. When we're thinking about division problems, something like dividing up land, we want to ask these same kinds of questions about who needs to agree. Do specific people need to agree? Is unanimity required? Who's in a position to block the reconfiguration from happening? Are there coercive overrides? The same questions that we asked when we were talking about a traditional assembly problem like land assembly. So is division easier to accomplish? Sometimes people say yes, and it's because they're envisioning something like this. Someone owns this entire green square, and they're able to just split it up into lots and sell them. Okay, yes, looks very easy because we're assuming that this individual owns everything to start with and is able to, has the permission to, has no regulatory blocks of putting all these individual lots up for sale separately. And of course, anyone can be a buyer. So it's not specific people who need to agree. So even though maybe, in order to fully divide it, we need to sell all the lots, they can be sold to anyone. It's not a problem like assembling from particular owners. However, we might find that our problem of division gets much harder and starts to be more like traditional assembly problems if we have a bunch of co-owners Okay, let's say that we have 10 co-owners who want to partition the land, and they're trying to figure out how to divide it up, and they all need to agree unless they're going to go to court and get a judicial partition that's a coercive solution. Well, now it starts to look difficult because we have to get buy-in from everybody. Similarly, if we have a park like this and we want to subdivide it, and we have neighbors or regulators who have at least de facto power to block, that can be just as difficult as assembling land, because again, we're needing to assemble cooperation to the reconfiguration. Okay, another issue that comes up, and we see this coming through in the sharing economy, is the idea of dividing up an asset in new ways. So splitting something up that's lumpy, like a car. A car is very lumpy, acquiring it's a big deal, and then you have it all the time. A lot of times people might just want a slice of transportation, not physically that part of the car, but they want just the ability to use a car sometimes. And to have a successful platform-based way of sharing transportation or any other lumpy asset, you need to be able to assemble enough users who are going to take all the slices so that you can actually have a viable market in this. And that too is an assembly problem, even though it looks like we're just dividing up an asset. Okay, so a related issue, and this is something that was just discussed very, very well in a recent working paper I ran across about achieving scale collectively, is the need to sometimes use a large, expensive asset in order to produce value as a firm. And it may be that this is going to be so costly that small firms cannot afford to own their own machine. This machine here turns out to be something called a thickness planer, which is used to produce doors. And it's expensive. The study of Bassi et al. Was looking at small firms in Uganda that would share one of these through rental market arrangements, so that multiple firms could use the same planer. What this does is it lets them exploit economies of scale that otherwise would be impossible if each firm had to acquire its own thickness planer. It would have to have a production level that's far above what it could achieve as a small firm, given the labor market realities and the sort of optimal size from like a labor market perspective. So thinking about how to put together firms in this way becomes important. A similar set of issues, and this is some new research I'm working on right now, comes into play when we think about consumer products that have high fixed costs. And you need to have enough customers in order to be able to make it be viable. Okay, so we see different strategies out there about assembling consumers together to cover fixed costs. One model that we see a lot of is the combination restaurant. Something like this is pretty common in the US, where we have a Baskin-Robbins store, which is an ice cream store, and a Dunkin' Donuts that is a donut and coffee shop. And they are complementary in that most of the time, depending on the time of day or the season or whatever, demand for coffee and donuts will be strong and demand for ice cream will be weak, or vice versa. And so having both of them able to share a building space and a lot of the fixed costs ends up being very efficient in being able to exploit economies of scale more quickly through these sort of multi-branded restaurants. Another way that we can reach fixed costs and cover them involves standardization. Okay, so having economies of scale by having a fewer selection of products is one way. Traditionally, that the problem of assembling enough consumers to cover fixed costs could be met. So this is a famous example from Henry Ford. The Model T was highly standardized along many dimensions, including paint color. And sort of famously, Henry Ford said that any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. Didn't want to get into creating a lot of customized colors that would mess up the efficiencies of the assembly line in just creating one product. Now, this can have drawbacks for the consumer, right? The fact that you have high fixed costs, need to assemble a lot of people around some standardized product to cover them, means that there's going to be less variety out there, and they may not be able to get the color they want. And we see this in all kinds of contexts, and not just cars, but other things. Pop-Tart flavors, for example, these are breakfast pastries that certain flavors come and go. The example here is a strawberry cheese Danish Pop-Tart that disappeared. There was actually an online petition to try to bring it back. It didn't work. They were unsuccessful in doing this. But it's often the case that beloved products that turn out to only serve narrow markets may get discontinued, or they may not get made in the first place. And so thinking about ways to cover the fixed costs of an additional variety is an assembly problem that is something that is in the interest of consumers to find ways to solve. Okay, so one way that these kinds of problems sometimes get solved is this so-called long tail that we get from having online shopping and the ability to aggregate consumers from all over the globe to consume products that might have a relatively narrow local market. Okay, so this can enhance the ability to put together more consumers to cover fixed costs and assemble and solve an assembly problem in that way. Now, this is not always possible. Sometimes you have a good or a service that has to be consumed locally, and it's not possible to aggregate people from all over the place. Or you have something like an airline route that's going between two cities. And you can't assemble people from all over the planet to be on that airline route. It has to be people who want to be on that, going between those particular two cities. So there can be instances where you have high fixed costs and there's not a kind of worldwide pool of demand to draw on. And one way of addressing that is, this is a well-known point, but I think it's important to kind of cast it as an assembly issue, is to try to assemble revenue from people in varying amounts in order to cover the fixed costs. And this is sometimes described as voluntary price discrimination. Henry Hansman, starting in the 80s, wrote about this as a way in which nonprofits can cover fixed costs in contexts like opera, where it costs a lot to create a production, and you can't really cover it all through ticket sales because you can't sort of raise them high enough and still get enough people to buy them. You can try to do different, better seats and worse seats, but there's limits to that. And so having people be able to pay more voluntarily ends up being in their own interest, because it enables a product to be made that otherwise wouldn't be made. So we see lots of examples of this sort of voluntary idea of paying more, or having a pay what you want model or something like that. On the left is just a recent example from the Shed Aquarium in Chicago that runs a kayaking program, and you can pay what you want to go on the kayaks. You have to pay at least $20, but then you can pay more. And the idea is that some people will pay more to help support the conservation program and to cover the costs of running it. On the right-hand side, we have the famous Radiohead example, the experimentation with making an album available online for download on a pay-what-you-want basis. Okay, so some of these examples have been more or less successful, but the idea of assembling revenue in ways that will cover fixed costs is very powerful, and it can argue for a form of price discrimination that might be in the interest of even those who pay more money to be part of. Okay, so that's sort of where a project I'm working on right now is on optional price discrimination, and whether it could be extended into more markets and not just confined to the nonprofit context as it often has been. So the kind of problem that we face when we're thinking about a product that has large fixed costs, and I've tried to draw the graph here, so I'm not sure about my graph drawing skills, but I tried to draw it so that the curve is really showing that you really only have fixed costs and no marginal costs. It creates this kind of shape that average costs drop in this fashion as you add more, because you have high fixed costs. If we imagine a demand curve that is like the diagonal line here, and this whole area is the benefits that people would receive from having this product that has high fixed costs, well, how are you going to be able to cover it? The way the graph is drawn, the average costs lie above the demand curve at every point. Okay, so what that means is that there's no uniform price you could come up with that would cover them. As you can see, if we try to set a uniform price here, there's a little bit of a gap that means that there's no uniform price that enough people would be willing to pay. However, the benefits do exceed the costs. So this product would be worth making if we could find a way to allocate the costs differently. So if we think about our block of costs here that we have to meet somehow, and we can't do it with a uniform price, but if we sort of change things around, and we could do it many ways, but this is one example, so that the pricing is like this, then there would be the ability to have this product. That requires some form of price discrimination, some form of mechanism for making that occur. So thinking about how that might operate in a context outside of the nonprofit context is something I'm working on now, and I'm happy to say more about that idea in question and answer if people are interested. What I want to do next, though, is just talk a little bit about solutions. My title talks about assembly problems, and we've heard a lot about those, but I'm also interested in solutions. And here we can think about maybe using options as a way of overcoming certain kinds of assembly problems by letting people state the terms on which they're willing to engage or participate or cooperate, and often making that contingent on other people's cooperation. So if we're trying to put together this pie, we can just sort of imagine whatever you want to think of as the resource we're assembling here. We could have slice owners that write call options that someone who's putting together the pie can exercise. We could have pie owners that a pie owner that writes the call options that slice buyers can exercise if it all starts as one thing. This is the dividing up the resource issue. Or we could have a pie maker who writes put options that let the slice owners force a sale at a price that scales up for everyone, depending on how many pieces are assembled. A real world example of this idea comes up in habitat conservation areas, where sometimes there are bonuses given if you put under conservation easement at the same time contiguous pieces. So there's ways to kind of use options to try to address assembly problems. And in general, though, this is my last point here. I would encourage research in the realm of configuration entrepreneurship. So it'd be great if it were a superpower that we could just do, but we need to really design around configuration and figure out what works and what doesn't, and think about the range of problems that can be addressed through better configuration. And a few ideas and moving parts that are out there, that some of which there is research on and others could use more research, is thinking about the relevance of contribution increments, how those are defined and how those are allocated as an important part of the story. Thinking about contingent commitments, right? Where someone agrees to do something if enough others also agree to do it, as a way of kind of creating an assembly that will work. And then some of my recent work is also about visibility and the need for visible progress towards a goal, and whether you can see that something is making a difference. Now, this is a little bit of a two-edged sword, because sometimes if you see that others are contributing, it might let you free ride more. So I don't want to suggest any of these are like the answer, but research into exactly how they work seems important. Those are all things about getting people to contribute. Once you've contributed to something, there's also this issue of, kind of what happens if the contributions are either not enough to reach the threshold you need, or they're too much. What kind of regime do you have for refunds of either the inadequate amounts or excess amounts? What kinds of arrangements do you have for what I'm calling here raid proofing? So if we imagine putting together, assembling something in some space, if we're thinking about something like money that we're trying to save up towards a goal, is there a chance that as we try to assemble it, someone else is going to come and take away some of that that has been stored up? That can become a real problem. Similar issue with the examples of things like hunting, like the passenger pigeon. If somebody forbears and effectively contributes their non-hunting, does someone else take up the slack? That would be another form of raiding. How do we raid proof? And then surplus division. If we manage to do a reconfiguration, it is valuable, so that we're gaining something as a result. What kind of rules can we create for how that surplus will be divided in order to encourage these kinds of valuable reconfigurations? What kinds of commitments can be made in advance? So these are some of the moving parts that I think are really important as we think about the full range of assembly problems, not just the ones that are traditional assembly problems, but also ones that are sort of new, maybe newly recast as assembly problems. All right, so I will stop there with thanks to all of you for your attention, and I would love to hear questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Fennell, for your brilliant presentation. Now we have some questions. I'm pretty sure that our audience, although in economics scholars, have been really interested in many of your suggestions, and you touched upon some topics that are also the focus of research here in this conference and more generally by the members of the society. Okay, so I'm collecting questions now. I can start with one question. I would like to ask you to elaborate about the distributive implications of assembly. That is, how the configuration of resources has an impact also on the way that we distribute them or make them accessible. Meaning that the main examples that you provided about the possibility to foster cooperation when some resources need to be made complementary also suggests the possibility that a fair division of the surplus could be embedded in the complementarity of the resources. That is, to the extent that some way to aggregate, to bundle resources becomes acceptable in a specific legal system or in a specific society, well, that kind of configuration should also be designed in such a way also to provide an acceptable division of the surplus. So from this point of view, we could try to identify the distributive implications of the configuration problem. And this is something that you already wrote about, but could you please explain more explicitly how this surplus division issue could be matched with the configuration problem from the point of view of optimizing the efficiency of the resources?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I am very interested in thinking about the distributive implications of assembly because once you put together something in a new configuration and you're generating some surplus from it, you know, how are you going to distribute that? And this is actually one of the issues that's come up a lot in the context of eminent domain, because if you're paying people only fair market value for their property, because you're forcing them to sell it, then they're by definition not getting any of the surplus from the assembly process. In fact, they are probably going to be losing, like actually losing something, and as a result, if their valuation is in excess of the fair market value. So that is one issue that creates a lot of concern around eminent domain and a lot of the pushback on it. So I think what is important as we think about distributive issues is kind of thinking about what distributive rules for dividing surplus we want to have in place and getting those and finding the mechanisms that can kind of bring those about. So one context that I'm interested in is thinking about how if you have development in an area, one issue, you know, there's lots of housing affordability problems in the US, and one big issue is gentrification. If we start to redevelop an area, is it going to, you know, maybe this is something that we would think of as an assembly issue as we start to redevelop and add new development to an area. Is it going to displace people who are there? Is it going to make it too expensive for them to remain in place, even if they aren't physically displaced because of the changes that come about? And so one thing that we might think about is having some kind of financial instruments, and this is an idea that has been suggested by others before me. But if we had some kind of financial instrument that could let them share in the gains, people who are already present in the community who maybe are renting and don't have any property that's going to appreciate in value, could we give them something that's similar to having the stake of a homeowner that will appreciate in value? So I think that it's important as we think about assembly problems to think about how the gains are going to be distributed and how the ways of delivering those gains can be structured so that there can be realistic commitments and ones that are feasible to, that people can understand will be followed through on. In the context of price discrimination, I've been thinking a lot about the distributive implications there because there are a lot of worries about people being exploited by suppliers, producers who are going to try to extract all the surplus from them. But price discrimination, of course, does have the potential to have very good distributive consequences when we're talking about something that has high fixed costs, where once it's been created, if you think about intellectual property, once the thing has been created, then extending it to more people can be done at very close to zero marginal cost. And so having a way in which everyone can access it at their own valuation, or everyone who's willing to cover the marginal cost of producing it, could actually make goods very much more widely accessible and could have very good distributive benefits. So those are just a couple of the places where I've been thinking about this in concrete ways, but I see it as very much a part of what the configuration entrepreneurship has to be about, is not just figuring out what the gains are, but how to actually distribute them in a way that will, part of it's practical. We want to distribute them in a way that will actually enable the assembly to happen. And there we have to recognize that there are often political barriers that relate very much to kind of the distribution of gains that can keep assemblies from happening. So recognizing ways of bringing that about, I think, is very much part of what we want to do when we're thinking about how to engineer better solutions for assembly problems.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, indeed. I think that in many of your examples, there are aspects of distributive justice, which to some extent allow the aggregation of the resources to become feasible. Yeah, now I have some questions. Please.
Thank you very much. This is Nadia Vanderkovi. I wanted to ask you, just following up to what you just mentioned about the distributive effect, because it's very interesting to think about assembling strategies. And we have some research agenda ongoing in which we think about, for example, common pool resources where there are conflicting interests. So you actually have, imagine you have two assemblies that actually want the opposite. So do you think there is a design in assembling strategies that could help, for example, mitigate conflicts over the same resource? And make a very simple example, right? In the Amazon forest, you have a population increase, you have people who burn small pieces of land. Of course, that's not the main reason why the forests are burning, but there are people there also who burn the forests to just build a house. And then you have the global community that is interested in the forest not being burned down because of the oxygen that it's producing. So in both cases, somehow, it is a common pool resource, but at different levels, right? So you have a local level that is in contrast with a global level. And I was wondering if the assembling strategies that we investigate, if you think there could be a design that somehow helps counter-compensate or finding a solution between such conflicts.
I don't know.
Sorry.
Could you add the question?
I think I caught part of the question, so I'll say what I understood, and then maybe if there's any gaps, you can fill me in. So what I understood from it was we're thinking about common pool resources where there might be both a local use of the resource and something that has more of a global impact. Is that the question? Sort of how to balance those two types of goals?
Yes, the idea.
Just a moment, because we are using another microphone.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. So maybe you can hear me better from here.
Oh, much better. That's much better. Yes.
So the idea is just that if we imagine a common pool resource like the Amazon forest or fishing stocks, right, or forests, to have a local and a global use, but where communities, so the global community and the local community actually have conflicting interests, right? So we may have a local community that wants to preserve fishing rights and the global community that wants to eat fish, but so we have a conflict over the resource. So I was wondering if the assembling strategies that you talk about could actually, do you think they could produce a design in which such group conflicts of different levels over the same resource can be mitigated or resolved somehow?
Yeah, so potentially, I mean, one thing might be when we think about that conflict that you're describing between the local desired use of the resource and the global use, you know, what is the nature of that conflict? Is it the case that one of those uses is somehow not accounting, the reason why that's the desired use is because it's not accounting for externalities that are either positive or negative in some setting? So is there a global market for some good that is not accounting for the impact on the local culture, on you know, what's actually happening on the ground? Or is there something about the local desire to use the resource that isn't accounting for the positive externalities that would happen if there was some different use, like conservation? So my impression, and I haven't studied this in great depth, my impression is that in some contexts, for example, having tourism become, you know, some kind of ecotourism become a valuable use can then alter in some places what is understood to be the best use of a particular resource, in that maybe something that might have seemed like the extractive use was the more valuable one. There might be a change of view about that if there starts to be something that is going to more than compensate in terms of the opportunity cost. And it reminds me a little bit of the kind of bobolink example I was talking about, where there could be, you know, there are farmers who want to, you know, they're baling hay. I don't know a lot about haying, but they're wanting to get, you know, use the resource in a particular way. And so what is required is to pay their opportunity cost, basically, of delay in doing something in order to enable it to be habitat preserving. And so there is an assembly issue of putting together all of the you know, sort of votes with money, in a sense, having people put together contributions in order to establish priority for a different use and to compensate for delaying the timing of when this will happen. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that all of these kinds of conflicts are going to be like readily amenable to some kind of conflict resolution along these lines, but it often may be that there's just some costs or benefits that aren't getting counted in one of the two calculations, and that by finding a way to make visible and to create platforms for coordinating and communicating, you know, and sort of also putting money where their mouth is, in the sense of actually contributing to make certain that that if someone's being asked to refrain from some particular extractive use, that they're being made whole in some way for doing that. That may alleviate some of these issues where we have different types of resources that are different types of resource uses that are in conflict.
Thanks a lot. So other questions? Okay, we have a few questions more. Just a moment, we are just using the right microphone.
Trento. Thanks for do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Can you hear now?
A little bit. It's not quite as clear as before.
Okay. Try again. Now, do you hear me?
That's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So thanks for your fascinating talk. I have a question maybe about an old problem of assembly. Maybe I am thinking about a problem investigated in particular by Mankur Olson, on the fact that a part of a group can control the entire group. So the idea is that a subgroup can control the large group and then can extract private benefit. Think about the assembly in a corporation. A stockholder or a group of shareholders can control the rest of assembly, the entire assembly, and then can obtain private benefits of control. So my question is still a problem for assembly, or is it only an old problem and then you can propose some remedies about that?
Okay, so I'm not sure I fully got everything, but I think your question is about whether if we have groups that already where there's already an ability to kind of control an entire group, so that there is already kind of I guess we might think of it as already being a bit pre-assembled, in the sense that that we don't have to individually get buy-in from everybody because they're already part of a group and the entire group is able to act as a unit. So in those kinds of contexts, I think the nature of the assembly problem is just different. So in property contexts, we're accustomed to thinking of it as individual landowners or something like that, where individual claims are present and you're getting buy-in from those people in agreeing to sell their asset or contribute what they have or to refrain from some act on their land. If you have some other organizational structure, so whether it is a corporation form, whether it is a government that controls what happens in some area, whatever kinds of structure that you have, then I think there's sometimes a bit of a second order assembly problem in trying to assemble whatever internal governance kinds of inputs are necessary to get a particular larger unit on board with something. So it could be that this is going to be something that's a political issue of trying to assemble enough votes to get something to happen. And then the advantage is that if you have a group that's already preformed, you can have that entire group's inputs all at once, but it shifts the problem internally into the organizational structure itself to assemble what's necessary within that structure. So it's a little bit of like Coase's theory of the firm, that we're looking at assembly problems in this context as a form of transaction costs. Is it going to be easier to figure out how to put together pieces that are separately held, different, completely different ownership structures, or is it going to be easier to put together cooperation using larger units where we're able to do some of it internally? I'm not certain if that completely gets at your question, but I did want to also kind of say, generally, I think very appropriately to this conference, that with a lot of these assembly problems, we do have this kind of second order problem that's in the background of how to assemble what we need in order to carry out the assembly. So if we think about something like an academic conference where we're putting together knowledge and ideas in new ways that are about figuring out questions of how to assemble resources in the real world, solving that kind of second order problem, how do we get ourselves together and communicate with each other and share ideas, is a first step to then being able to put together the technologies for actually assembling the resources in the world.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, one of the second order assembly problems that we have in this conference is how to put together all the resources from lawyers and economists to work on law and economics in Italy. And this is really a difficult second order problem. Yeah, okay. Other questions? Okay, so if we have no other questions, I wish to thank again Professor Fennell for her wonderful participation to this conference. But of course, we promise to invite her again in Italy as soon as possible.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed this.
And I hope to see you soon in person.
Likewise. Take care.
Okay, so we can now close the plenary session unless there is something else that Massimiliano or Lorenzo want to add. I think we can close the conference. And no, well, no big words to say, just thank you for coming. It was really wonderful to have all of you here, and I hope that we can meet again and again in the next years in next CIDE conferences. Thanks a lot. Grazie mille. Sembra che sia andato abbastanza bene, tranne in